Hey everyone, welcome to the Football Quizmaster. Today we are playing the game to guess the name of football players by their nationality, plus club, plus jersey number. You'll get 10 points for each correct answer, and the person who gives most answers correctly will win the game. So make sure to comment your scores down in the comment section. That being said, let's begin. The first question is, the player is Emiliano Martinez. Next up, the player is Niklas Süle. Next up, the player is Ben Chilwell. Next one up is the player is Ivan Perisic. Next up we have the player is Ferran Torres. Next question. The player is Julian Brandt. Next question. The player is Richard Lisson. Next up, the player is Idrissa Gueye. Next question. The player is Nemanja Matic. Next up, the player is Ferland Mendy. Next, the player is Joao Cancelo. Next question. The player is Jesus Manuel Corona. Next question. The player is Felipe Coutinho. Next question. The player is Callum Hudson-Odoi. Next up, the player is Dani Parejo. Next one. The player is Corentin Tolisso. Next question. The player is Kostas Tsimikas. Next question. The player is Alexander Zinchenko. Next one up is The player is Xavi Simons. Next question. The player is Dani Alves. Next up. The player is Kieran Trippier. Next question. The player is Jamal Musiala. Next one is... The player is Mason Greenwood. Next question. The player is Nacho. Next question. The player is Joel Matip. Next up. The player is Jorginho Wijnaldum. Next question. The player is Lucas Digne. Next question. The player is Marcus Llorente. The next question is... The player is Manuel Akanji. And the last question is... The player is Yuri Toelemans. How many did you get right? Leave your answers in the comments below. And also make sure you subscribe to the channel for more amazing content, and we'll see you next time.